Welcome to Casuals of Runeterra, another very special episode. We're talking about Arcane, Season 2, Episode 7, the beginning of Act 3. I'm your host, Ryan, here with the other host, Hetch.
We're finally into Act 3, and we can finally only have good vibes and happiness, kittens and rainbows.
Stop doing that. Stop
What?
the hallucinations, Hetch. This is me, your friend Ryan from reality. But we do get to talk about finally an episode that has had a death grip on the community since it came out, because I can say this episode was one, as I was watching it, my expectations were low, right? Because it kind of just threw us into, different timeline. It focused on Echo, which I wanted, but it focused it, like when the trio disappeared, it was so long ago when I watched it that it felt like, oh, I don't care. Just bring them back to all the craziness that's already happening. So to be Elseworld, I was kind of like, I don't know if I want to do this. That's at the beginning.
Because like you said, I mean, we haven't seen them since Act 1.
Yeah.
And now this is Act 3, where we finally get to see what happened instead of them just coming back.
Yeah.
This is the closest that the show has felt to being disjointed.
Yeah.
But then, once you're actually watching the content, it's like, this is really, really good. And it's had a death grip on everyone for a while. I am sure there's got to be at least one listener who's just been itching for us to get to this episode and hear our thoughts on it. And the good news for you is that you get to continue to wait, because up top is housekeeping.
Yeah, you can listen to us everywhere. Visit us at podcastcore.com for all of our info. Email us at podcastcore@gmail.com. Remember, that's COR. Follow us on all the platforms. And now we have a Blue Sky account. So we'll start posting on there as we used to on Twitter. Twitter's a cesspool. We're no longer doing that. But
Fair.
Keep an eye out for that. We'll add that to our socials as well. And then leave a like and comment wherever you listen. We appreciate it. It's helped us get this far. But something else that has helped has been word of mouth from you to a friend to learn what could have been by listening to the Casuals of Runeterra podcast.
Oh, what could have been? Oh, my Lord. This episode's going to hurt.
Yeah, my only letdown, I guess we'll say that for discussion. Okay.
Yeah, let's say that. If you want to hear Ryan's only letdown, hang out with us at the end of the episode.
Yeah, so all good stories are told in 3 parts. So we start, as usual, with part 1. And after this incident with the wild rune early in the season, Echo appears in an office and he's panicked because he doesn't know what's going on. And then Powder, as an adult, walks in. So obviously he freaks out. He grabs a letter opener. I didn't think that was the way he was going to freak out. And then he attempts to back his way out of the room, not knowing what the hell's going on. And then the door opens and in comes Benzo, also alive. And Echo immediately loses it and kind of runs to hug him and begins to cry.
So, we just start off really, really mellow. It is we're talking just right out of the gate, right plucking the heartstrings. And it's this is kind of a refreshing way to have this emotional onslaught, because this isn't the first emotional onslaught that Arcane's given us. If you haven't listened to our last episode for episode 6 of season 2, hit that one up. But this one's a lot more refreshing because it's one of the characters that has not been utilized in this space at all. So it's helping remind you, as far as just the human element to all of the characters involved here. I mean, we've talked at length of how cool seeing Singe's content in the background for these episodes have been, and it's humanizing him. It's nice to get a more human element out of Echo, because Echo isn't one of the psychotic characters that we've been getting that from, right? They're not trying to humanize a mass murderer. They're not trying to humanize a mad scientist developing weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. They're humanizing a kid. A kid who went through a lot of really bad stuff and just tried to keep the pieces together. So this is refreshing.
Yeah, and it's a side of growth for Echo as a character as well, even though he hasn't had much time on screen to grow. Because Echo, as we've seen him, is a very cautious person. Even being someone who's very intelligent and has the whimsy of wanting to do cool things, he's always very suspicious of what's going around him, or very conscious and suspicious of what's going on around him with the people he's involved with and also his situation, right? He's not really a risk taker in the sense of like a Jinx, right? Who will do something crazy, or even Jace, where Jace and Victor being intelligent were risky, right? They were willing to do things that Echo probably wouldn't do because he's from a background that doesn't have the privilege of recovering from mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So seeing him in this situation behaving in a very human way where he doesn't know if he's dreaming, he doesn't know if there's some demonic thing happening, and he's responding as such. Like he's constantly in a daze. And even this next section where, he finally groups up with them and they head to Vander's bar, which is still standing. And he's still in a daze the whole way there because everything is so surreal to him. Not in a creepy way, but in a calm, peaceful way, which he's not used to peace at any point in his life. And they walk in, Vander's behind the bar and he can't believe that. And he still can't even focus as he sits down with Powder on what she's saying to him. And then to add, a cherry on top, Milo and Clagger sit down across from him and he's like, what the fuck is happening?
So we're seeing a lot of dead people.
Yeah.
Like Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis appears in the background, just like just staring at Echo. Just like I know what you see. All right. But yeah, I mean, this is just a big and huge culture shock, and it just is continually being presented through Echo's perspective.
Yeah.
So even though like we get to see what's going on and we can kind of understand what's going on, like there's a lot of disjointed imagery of just kind of showing like what Echo's psyche is in this moment, how hard he's working to try to keep it together in his own head. And he's like, I'm crazy. Like I'm going crazy. So like even though it's kind of a quiet scene, right? Like we're going into Vander's bar. All of these characters that we've watched die are still alive, but for them it's another Tuesday. They're talking about a party that's coming up. They're like, there's a party coming up. Milo and Clagger were doing some kind of air purification project for Jinx. Well, for Powder. So like Powder's like pulling the strings as far as keeping the group together. Yeah. And for them, it's just another Tuesday in Zaun, and Echo's over there just having a PTSD Vietnam flashback. Yeah. And that's the perspective we're seeing it in. So it feels really crazy, even though it's a quiet scene.
And great narrative work too, because you made a great point that all of this, the majority of this episode is through Echo's perspective. So all these good things we see happening, we're like, oh shit, that's cool. Yay, we're clapping and we're happy. He's in hell, right? Because there are no parties in Zaun in his timeline, right? He doesn't get to experience any of this anymore. And he hasn't gotten to, this is very important, he hasn't got to experience this stuff from childhood because Benzo died when he was a kid. Yep. Okay. So it's the same thing when we talk about Vi. Like, hey, Vi was in prison for 10 years. You have to keep this stuff in mind. And the narrative is written as such. So even at this point, Clagger, Milo sit across from him, and then Heimer comes in. And that's when the panic reaches this, peak to the point where he runs outside and vomits, right? And he runs outside the bar and Heimer follows him because he doesn't even know if this is the same Heimer. And Heimer kind of lets him know, no, it's me, kid. I've been waiting for you to get here. I didn't know if you were going to get here, but I've been here for a very, very long time waiting, and I'm happy you showed up. And that's when he confirms to him that we are in a parallel universe where essentially Hex Tech wasn't invented. And this is going to make us returning, which is Echo's immediate first thought, kind of difficult. Or as Heimer said, variable.
You gotta be very positive when you're giving bad news when you're intelligent. Yeah. Just like, it's variable.
Yeah.
It's difficult. Like they have he has no idea how they're gonna get back, right? Yeah. And this is a scene that I think like perfectly highlights Um, it's something that I think it could be considered a critique of the show, like something that's not handled too well, but I think
Mhm.
it's just handled in a nuanced way. And this scene is a perfect example of that, of because like the timeline of Arcane is very hard to follow if you're not paying good attention.
Yep.
Because as far as like this timeline right here, Heimerdinger spells out like the timeline of how long he's been here, but it's literally one line, and he gives an exact like a very exact number of how long he's been waiting for Echo
Yeah.
to get here. So even though like everything in the normal timeline, like the art for the sake of brevity, like timeline one, everything in timeline one is really happening fast and it's all on the heels of each other, or at least it feels that way. Heimerdinger's been waiting for Echo for over 3 years. So
Yeah.
for them, they've been gone for 3 years. Or at least for Heimerdinger, he's been gone for 3 years. For Echo, he's probably been gone just a couple seconds.
Yeah.
We haven't even seen Jace yet, so we don't know how long he's been waiting where he is.
Yeah.
So, like, if you're not paying really good attention, you miss these nuanced things of like them spelling out the timeline, which is also one of the reasons that I think people forget that like Vi was in prison for 10 years.
Yeah.
Like because a lot of people are just like, oh, she went to prison, got out.
Yeah.
Yeah, went to prison and 10 years later got out.
Where do
Like
you think
that.
all the tattoos came from?
Like,
She has a lot of tattoos.
you have to have like those frames of reference, and
Yeah.
if you're not paying attention and miss them, like it can be very confusing, especially Heimerdinger's behavior for this whole episode
Yes.
will be very confusing if you miss the fact that he's been waiting for 3 years.
Yeah, he's very comfortable in this new environment. And he's also Yordle that's been alive for 1,000+ years. So the other, and this is why our show is so important and it should be government mandated. Because
Amen.
you have an endless library to go see what the hell is going on at any point. But all to say is, you brought up Jace the boy, and we do get to see Jace after a good chunk of the episode at this point, and he ended up somewhere. he is definitely somewhere, and it's less inhabited, and it's basically a complete wasteland. And this cloaked figure shows up, doesn't respond, doesn't talk, just stands there, and Jace begins to follow them as they walk away. And as he's following this cloaked figure, he's seeing like these husks of people in a very Pompeii-like way, right? Like the ashes post volcano explosion. And then he sees it. He sees it in a panoramic view, and he's like, oh shit, he can tell it's a completely destroyed Piltover.
And the imagery of this scene is not only just gorgeous and really just kind of
Yeah.
like Fortiche just patting their own back of like, look what we can do. Not only is it that, but like they're giving a lot of clues, and they're clues that they've been giving us since episode 6 of what Jace is experiencing, because the first imagery that we see with like the floating like crescent rubble is from the blast that he hit Victor with in
Yep.
episode 6. And so it's like, okay, cool. Like these timelines are somehow connected in some way, or at the very least, there are similarities enough to what is happening in timeline one
Mhm.
to this timeline two that Jace is experiencing. So like the imagery is the storytelling for this scene, and you just got to go see it. Like it's really well done.
Yeah. And that wraps up part one. It takes us to part two, and we go back immediately to Echo and where he's at. And he's now in Powder's hideout, and he finds out that Vi is dead. And he also finds out that she died during the heist that he gave them the tip on in the original timeline. And during this conversation, Echo's really focused completely on getting home. He's in an analytical mindset as he's essentially interrogating Powder, and he's not really even considering how he's making her feel, because ultimately, at this point, we don't know who he is to her in this timeline. He doesn't know their history, he doesn't know what's going on, but he doesn't care, because this is also a great part of expressing Echo's personality to us, because he kind of comes off as an asshole. He comes off as someone who is very like he doesn't care about Powder. We're getting to see Powder as the audience, so we care about her, right? We know what she went through. We get to see her as an adult living the life we want her to live. And Echo's now here, who's the Echo we like, but treating her like crap. It's like, dude, hey, read the room. But he's unable to read the room because you put yourself in that situation, right?
Yep.
He hasn't been there for 3 years like Heimer has been there. He just got there. He knows what he needs to get back to because there are people who depend on him as a militant leader, right? So he's like, I have to get back. Like they're going through stuff. I can't just be here having a good time. I don't care what happened to you or who you are to whatever. Just I need to get home. So answer these questions. Yeah.
And like all of that is just Echo reacting from a place of trauma as
Yes.
well.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
they do a really good job
Hurt
of
people
kind
hurt
of
people.
yeah, like they're doing a good job of really kind of like reminding you that this is all coming from a place of trauma because it's like he sees Benzo and that's what initially breaks him down when he first gets here. He's now treating Powder like shit, but it's because like I'm jumping ahead a little bit like by a few seconds, but they actually give flashbacks to like the scene of him and Jinx fighting on the bridge to Piltover
Yeah.
and from
She's an enemy
season
to him.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you go back to season one and remember like the lead up to that fight scene, is a lot of that is Echo telling Vi that like, no, Powder's dead.
Mm-hmm.
There's only Jinx. The last time he tried to take care of Powder, it ended in a fight.
Yeah.
And not just, like a verbal argument. It ended in a life or death situation.
Yep.
So, of course, he's going to treat Powder like shit because it's like, I know what happened the last time I tried to save you, despite the fact that this is not Powder fighting with Jinx. This is just Powder.
Yep.
And he doesn't know that. Like it's great storytelling, but it's also kind of like it's hard to watch if you're just over here like feeling bad for Powder. Like if you feel bad for Powder, this is a hard scene to watch because he really is an asshole.
Yeah, and this is a great way to, if you have to express somebody, like writing a narrative properly, right? And within the realm of what you've established versus trying to cater towards the audience. Because like I said, we want Echo to be nice to her, but he's not going to be because that's not realistic to the context, right? So we then get this music montage, which is, Echo leaves, obviously, leaves Powder there. Powder's pissed. But he doesn't care. He leaves and he starts to figure out the next step, right? He goes to find Heimer and then figure out how to get to the heist site or whatever and find out the next steps. And we get a little music montage here of him exploring a Zon that is nothing like he would have ever imagined, right? The air is clean. And he's seeing kids running around. He's seeing people happy. He's seeing people smiling. He's seeing people thriving. And that's just something that starts to slowly work on his psyche and make him feel good. He's experiencing it directly rather than just hearing it through others, right? And then as we have this, we have Jace. We have the juxtaposition of Jace making his way through hell. And essentially this broken, destroyed Piltover, and then Jace encounters where like these zombie-like automatons that are kind of stalking him and following him, and he panics, begins running, and has a misstep, falls off a cliff into a hole, hits the ground, and loses consciousness.
Yeah, jacks up his legs too.
Breaks those.
Heimerdinger is having a street show, enjoying his country music career.
Heimerdinger's in Nashville.
Echo is experiencing the farmers markets of Nashville. They're living their best Southeastern life, and Jace is trapped in Vietnam.
Yeah, and so, as we go, so we get back and forth bouncing. This happens for the rest of the episode. Now that we've introduced where Jace is, we get cuts here and there, and they use them to kind of manage the tempo of this episode. But Echo and Heimer are now together. They're going to find the hex shards, right? And they talk about, as they find them at the heist site, because remember, different outcome. Like Vi died, so they never got the hex shards out. And they're still there because the explosion did happen. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we do get like a little bit of a flashback of how the heist went down because not only because the explosion did happen, Like
Exactly.
that is something that did happen, but the difference is that Vi died in the explosion,
Hmm.
and they didn't run.
Yep.
Like so it was powder forcers holding a dead Vi
Yep.
with Milo and Clagger there also like we don't know what to do. And Marcus is the one that finds them. And this is clearly what is setting the stage for the big difference in what happens here, right? Because one of the differences in the timeline one is that no one died in the explosion. So
Hmm.
we don't really get to see how dangerous Hex Tech is until it's too late.
Hmm.
Whereas with this one, some kid died. And we tend, well, outside of America, society tends to band together to protect children. That might be a little too meta.
Yeah. I mean, listen, if you've listened to our show, you know what we're about here.
Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. Go on.
Yeah. So like that's clearly like one of the big differences here is that like the fact that like everyone gets to see the danger of Hex Tech right out of the gate
Hmm.
is something that like clearly set the stage for this branch off from timeline one. Um, but because of that, they don't dive deeper into what caused the explosion. They clearly just turned away from it in fear. And so that's why we don't have Hextech here.
Yeah.
Or at least that's my interpretation of it.
It's a smart, realistic, idealistic response to,
Idealistic is a keyword.
yeah, which is a response that we wish, our nations took. And this, even so during this, investigation from Eckenheimer, they decide, all right, we can try something with these shards, but we don't know what the outcome is going to be, especially on this timeline, right? Because there is nothing to base anything on. And we then hop back to Jason. He wakes up in pain with a broken leg. And for a bunch of days, we get this kind of time lapse of him slowly losing his mind while trying to survive. His hair's growing out, his beard's growing out, and he's in this damp hole. And he's trying his best. And then finally, he gets to the point of gaining enough strength once again, from like eating critters and then and drinking, rainwater that's been sitting, still water, the best water. And he gets the resolve too. It's him making the decision to live, to survive, and to get the fuck out of this hole. And he climbs out of there. Um, and that's a pretty impressive scene, right? Because we always wondered when we saw him earlier in the season, right? When he did the crazy stuff, and we're like, this dude's lost his fucking mind. We always wondered what happened to him. And this pretty much puts it in perspective of we've seen enough, man falls after climbing or on an excursion and then, loses his mind slowly as they try to find him. So we can all immediately draw clues from this time-lapsed scene.
And it's also really cool
Or
to see because this is the first time that we also see like Jace really go through like
hardships.
It's not the first time he's gone through hardships. It's the first time that he's gone through hardships without the backing of Piltover. Because I mean, like season one was a lot of hardships for Jace. Like he gets kicked out of the academy. He's trying to justify himself having all of these illegal products.
Yep.
And he loses the backing of the Karaman family before he gets it all back.
Yep.
Like, so he went through hardships, but then he got the backing, and then all the other hardships that we've seen him here, he's a freaking council member of Piltover.
Yeah.
But now he's just some poor dude losing his mind with a broken leg in the bottom of a canyon.
which is
we
great,
get to see his medal.
Which is great to your point, because I'm happy you broke it down like that, because it's a direct parallel to the dangers of living in Zon. Right? Because we've talked about in the first season about how big Zon is. And there are parts of Zon that if you venture there alone and you fall off a cliff or a small thing, a small, edge into a hole, and you break your leg, no one's going to find you. Yep. And the atmosphere and the way, and that's the crazy thing about this is, remember, he's in a post-apocalyptic Piltover. And this situation, you could see happening in a current timeline Zon.
Yeah. Like, so we it's nice to see that, like, he still has the metal
Yeah,
to, not be a pampered brat.
yeah,
Like, he's gonna grit his teeth and he's gonna get through it. But man, he has to go through it to get through it,
yeah.
right? Um, but like I didn't even make the connection as far as like the parallel. Like, it really is a parallel. Like, a bad water quality,
Yep,
bad air quality,
yep.
like no one there to help you.
Yeah, he
Eh,
finally understands what Echo was saying when Echo was
yeah,
like, "Dude, you're not considering there are people down here, right?" So
yeah.
this takes us, speaking of Echo, we go back to Echo, and he finally, now that he's gone through a couple steps of just experiencing this world he's in, he goes back to Powder and takes her to what we know as the Firelight hideout. I believe so. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But in his timeline, that's where the Great Tree is. That's where the Firelights hang out. But here, none of that happened, right? There are no firelights. So he paints a mural because he's an artist as well. And he paints a mural of his timelines Vi as an adult and then brings Powder to see it. And that was a moment, I think, that, it shows that Echo is not a cold, unfeeling person because of his circumstances. It's something that he still at his core cares about people, right? And we know that. I mean, he's a leader of the Firelights, right? We understand that. But now we're getting that expressed in this context. And that was a great turnaround to see, to kind of redeem how people at least how I started feeling about him. I was like, boy, get your shit together. You're too smart for this, right? You're hurting the people around you. But yeah, him bringing Powder here and then ultimately finding a way to tell her, which she kind of figured out. If you're watching it, you're paying attention to like the social cues. She's smart enough. She's on the same level as him intelligence wise. She's smart enough to figure out what's going on, that he's not her Echo. But this is him first. This is the first time he's telling her, listen, I had this dream, right, about a place where this happened. And he's essentially telling her about his timeline. And then essentially is leading up to asking her for her help, alongside Heimer, to help them build this hex portal.
And like, the dialogue here is very good because the writers have done a fantastic job of communicating like what Echo's goals are here, as well as communicating who he is as a person deep down. But they do a great job of communicating it in the current realm,
Yeah,
because as far as like for Powder's concerned, she is listening to him, like, and she's definitely smart enough to know there's something bigger going on,
yeah,
but she's framing all of her responses to everything that's actually going on in her
yeah,
timeline. So when Echo is saying that, it's like I feel like you because where in that dream you were very different,
yeah.
but because of you, a lot of incredible things
Mhm.
existed, and I feel like that is what is meant to happen. And she's framing her responses of like, oh well, now you sound like Vander telling me that I should do more than run the bar.
Yeah.
And so like she's framing it to stay within her reality, but still open to like, I know something bigger is going on. And so the dialogue here is incredible.
Oh, yeah.
And
And there's so much
uh,
more there that we can dig into later in the episode. Because it's already getting a little bit longer because we're having a good time, if you can't tell.
we've been waiting for this for so long.
Yeah, we really haven't got to break down Echo's character. So it's great to have this moment. But we then move on after he asks her. Obviously, she's going to help him. I love how. We'll get there. So Jace continues wandering through this wasteland. But this time, now he's gone through all this stuff, he no longer has fear. Once again, a parallel to people living in Zon that have grown up there, right? When you have Piltover people go to Zon, they're looking over their shoulder. You see this a lot for people who don't live in cities, right? Or aren't used to being around a lot of people. Where, if you lived out in the country your whole life, or you live in the suburbs and you have to go to the city, you're always like, oh, what if somebody robs me? What if this happens? What? Not knowing that the people around you are people, right? It's just there's more of you here. The environment's not the same environment, right? You're in the city, it's a little bit more dusty. And I feel like that's represented here with him going through all this hardship in a very condensed time frame, and then now coming out of the whole like, I don't give a fuck, right? Like, I'm a survivor essentially. And we then jump
Yep, yep.
back. Go ahead. All right.
Oh no, I was just gonna make a dumb joke.
Go ahead.
No,
Now you're on the
like
spot. Go ahead. It better be funny.
Survivor actually starts playing in the background.
Okay.
So
Some Destiny's Child.
that's right.
So then we hop back to Heimer and Echo and Powder because we can't focus on Jace too much. And they're now drawing up plans, right? And they're getting ready to test this. They start testing this hex portal to get it set up. And they're able to get a small, unstable working version going that rewinds time a few seconds. And everyone besides the person who pulls the lever or triggers it is affected by that time rewind. And Echo then tests, well, how far back can we go while tracking the seconds? And that's when we get the scene that people couldn't stop talking about, where essentially as he's testing it, Heimer fucking explodes. And then he returns back and he tells them, I think it's 4 seconds, and just trust me. My source,
Oh my God.
trust me, bro.
That scene is so freaking funny because like it like one, it shows like the Zaunite great minds versus the Piltover great
Yeah.
minds, because Heimerdinger's like, it's new technology, we don't want to push it so far, and then Powder and Echo just like make eye contact like, we're gonna crank it, like they like unspoken eye contact, like we know what we're gonna do, and then it's Heimerdinger blowing up, and then Echo, when he comes back and says the limit is 4 seconds, it is a smiling Powder, like hell yeah, a smiling Heimerdinger, like that's incredible. You know the limit. How do you know? And then just a shell-shocked Echo, like, nope. I've seen shit.
With a little piece of fuzz from Heimerdinger that blew up before the rewind on his face.
Incredible.
So good.
Absolute cinema.
Great scene. And then we wrap up part 2 here with obviously there's not enough time, but Powder tells Echo they need to make it to a party. There's a party, remember at the beginning, that they were going to celebrate the innovation competition and the results of that. And she's like, listen, you have to make this, right? This is a pretty big deal that obviously her Echo would have been excited for. And Heimer agrees when he tells him, he's like, listen, old man moment, find enjoyment in this situation. You're young. You don't know many of these. And, Heimer's come to learn a lot about how Echo grew up in the environment he grew up in by living with him, right? And the firelights. And he's like, you haven't had a lot of these moments. Go enjoy this. I'll take care of things here. And he stays behind and keeps working on the time device. And that's how we wrap up part 2.
And I think it's really cool, not only because Heimerdinger is giving Echo like the ability to like be a kid.
Yeah.
Like, because it's like, that's a heartfelt moment, but it's also just the first time we see Heimerdinger playing the game, because Heimerdinger does not like Hex Tech. He's at zero point of the show has Heimerdinger been pro Hex Tech. So now he's the one that's like, I think I know a way to amp it up.
Yeah.
Get out of here. Like, so the first time he's going to dabble in it, he's not sharing any of this information. So this is the first time we really see Heimerdinger start playing like the political game.
Yeah.
Because it's like, no, I'm going to help you. I'm going to improve the Hex Tech, but I refuse to share this knowledge. And that's a really cool, like, and it takes 10 seconds, but it's a really cool thing to just kind of put a nice final cherry on top of Heimerdinger as a character, of just like, I still don't trust this.
Yeah.
And because I don't trust this, I'm going to make sure that no one can tap into what I'm doing.
Yep. Exactly. So part 3, we go back to Jace. Now more confident than ever, still kind of broken and busted. He's climbing towards the top of the tower at the center of the wasteland, which he saw when he first got that first shot of it. And he figured, hey, let me get as to the center and as high as I can and see what's going on, right? And climbing out of that hole kind of prepared him for this situation. And then we cut back to the party. And this is a moment of levity we get where it's Echo at the bar. He's hanging out. Benzo's there and he's having another heart-to-heart with Benzo because remember, Benzo is dead. And he's kind of telling Benzo everything he couldn't tell him as an adult, right? Now that he's an adult. And they're waiting for Powder to arrive. And then he also sees behind the counter a surprise cameo, Silco, with a damaged eye, by the way. And he talks to Vander and he's kind of very pleasant and he's friendly. And Echo goes back into that, that nervous cat mode of like didn't he try to kill you? And even Soko says back, you learn as adults what to forgive and when to forgive and what the bigger purpose is. Because in this timeline, we now know that he actually got the letter from Vander about apologizing for that whole situation.
So, they gave us 2 episodes of asking what if, and then they answered what if.
Yeah.
So, and man, like, for everyone out there, as far as in the LGBTQ and like in the community,
Yeah.
like, y'all are eating well because um
guys,
we got
gals, and
Kate.
non-binary pals. Everyone's
Yep,
eating.
we got Kate Vi, and now we get like the it's more of a meme, I think.
Yeah.
But I enjoy the meme of Vander Silco
Yeah.
being dads.
Yeah.
Like,
The gay
it's
dads.
like the 2 gay dads raising Powder.
Yeah.
And Powder is now like pulling the strings in Zahn. So they're just so proud. And it's just like, y'all are eating well this season. And we haven't even given you everything yet.
Oh boy, we'll get there. One episode at a time. So music begins to play because that's been a theme here, and they always use it so well. And this is another instance of that. And Powder arrives in a very magnificent fashion. She's all dolled up, and Echo is stunned because this is the first time we get to see him taking in her presence in a romantic sense, right? And starting to really get what's going on. And we then get the scene that, all the internet talked about for days, where they dance and then they spend some time together outside, very reminiscent of, it's obviously an homage to Miles Morales and Through the Spider-Verse of how this is shot. And then during this time frame, Echo, outside of the mural situation, he actually tells her, thank you. Thanks for helping me. Thanks for being a part of this. And she basically confirms that she knows what's going on. She knows that you're not my Echo. I get that. But even through that, they have a kiss. And that's a big moment that immediately is cut to Jace in the pits of hell. And it's one of the best tempo switches I've ever witnessed. Dude, Fortiche and Riot were locked in when they were figuring out how to match these story beats. Because the amount of stuff that's happening just this episode alone. Remember, I told you, when I watched this for the first time and I saw how it started, I was like, I don't know if I want this episode. At this point, my mind has changed. This is one of the greatest episodes ever.
Like that cut is just like, they knew exactly how they wanted to tell this story, and they knew exactly how they were going to continue presenting ups and downs to the audience to where you just can't look away.
Yeah.
But not only was it just great storytelling, but that cut specifically is the birth of all the memes of the alternate timeline. So now after our comments, go consume all those memes again.
I mean, even the song that plays is a known French artist that has had top songs in the past, and that song ended up top on the charts. That's how popular not only the show but this episode was.
Yeah. We could have an entire episode just breaking down like this scene itself, because like with them dancing, it's done in 4 frames a second. And it's like, what does that mean? Like, we could go on at length.
Which is and that's another homage to Through the Spider-Verse, because there are scenes that are at different cadences when it comes to frames to represent different narrative elements.
And so we could go at length with it. Instead, hit us up at podcastcore@gmail.com, because I've already taken up all of Ryan's
tell us
time.
the parts that you like, that you got to dig into. So Jace makes it to the top of the tower. We go back to Echo, and after this moment that he's got to actually enjoy with Powder, he heads back to the lab and kind of leaves her there. And Heimer's there and tells him, hey, I figured it out. The whole place is shaking. Things are in motion. Classic mad scientry. Why was it? What? That's not a word.
Are you good? I don't think he's good. Cut it.
Fly off that shimmer. So he tells him, I figured this out. We cut back to Jace, and Jace has caught the cloaked figure. He's at the top of this tower, and he figures out that everything that's happened around him has been because of Hex Tech, and specifically what him and Victor did. And he also finds out that the person who gave him the crystal, or this cloaked figure, is the same person that gave him the crystal when he was younger, but he doesn't know why. Still, they're not really talking to him in any of these scenes. But then Jace just decides, listen, send me back. He has a resolve, and he knows what he has to do now that he's seen this hell.
And I highly encourage you to go rewatch this season because, especially like after your first watch through, like the scene of Jace telling this cloaked figure to send me back, the imagery of it is actually used again. And like watching it again, like getting ready for this episode was like, oh my God. Like the storytelling is just absolute peak. They've done a great job, and for me, I didn't appreciate it until the rewatch.
Yeah.
So like this scene specifically is like, holy shit, y'all knew what you were doing.
Yeah.
And it speaks for itself.
Yeah. And then we finally finish here at 40 minutes. They're back in the lab. The portals become unstable in a sense. And Heimer kind of thanks Echo for helping him truly live for one of the few times in his very long life. Because you can tell Heimer's having fun with this. And he hops out because they're both standing on the portal or on the base together. He hops out because it's not really working as expected and connects the final cable, tweaks some things. And then Heimer disappears as Powder arrives in the lab after everything has gone off. And lying there unconscious outside of the portal is her Echo. But inside the portal, as she looks up, she sees our Echo from the main timeline before he disappears. And during this scene, we also have it cut with Jace, telling him to send him back, but also promising to the cloaked figure that once you send me back, I will set things right. And we know where he ends up after saying that.
Yep. And we also see, as far as with him being asked or him asking to be sent back, the cloaked figure to initiate this is also touching one of these like Pompeii figures, and it gives Jace the hammer that he returns with.
Yep.
So this Pompeii figure is Jace from this timeline. So it's like, oh, like the figure has led him back to himself, which is absolutely kind of crazy.
Classic time
and
travel,
I love it
baby.
because this is like the goofy timeline, time travel crap that all nerds love, of just like the little ins and outs and how everything's connected together. It's just like, the chef's kiss. What a way to end this episode.
Yeah, and that's where we wrap up. And now we get to a little bit of general discussion here. Bear with us, right? Because it's been a while. We appreciate you hanging around. And we'll definitely talk about this in the future as we do more episodes after we're done finally getting through the Arcane episodes for you guys for season 2. But, two things I want to talk about here. The first one is how impressed, I mentioned earlier that I'll talk about at the end, how impressed I was with how they managed such a late romantic development. Because through the show, obviously the focus is Vi and Kate when it comes to the romance plot lines, right? And with Echo and Jinx, the unique thing here is that we don't really have a timeline where there is time for any of this to build. So within one episode, that's not even completely just their episode, they're able to give us a convincing argument of how this would all work out. What are the things that would bring these two people together? Outside of the fact that they grew up together as kids, right? And they got along and they're around the same age, we know from when they were younger in season 1. So that all lines up. But now we get a deeper understanding of both their personalities, who they are deep down, and how those work together to bring two people together, right? In a realistic way. It's not just, oh, by the way, these two characters like each other, we're going to ship them because that will get clicks. It wasn't that. It's a very natural thing that has enough foundation, even though it's built across timelines. There's enough foundation there for, the community really to latch on just as strongly as the Kate Vi fans out there.
Yeah, and like to that point, like the key word that you threw out there that I think is the what makes this feel as good as it is that it was a natural kind of progression. They didn't fall into a trope.
Yeah.
And this was very easy to fall into a trope because these are two characters who have gone through a lot of
Yeah.
trauma. And this was so it's like the formula to have like the oh, two characters experience a traumatic
Yeah.
story and then like they hook up. Like
The
they could have done
suspension
that
bridge
so
concept.
easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they could have done that so easily, and the show has nothing but material for them to use
Mhm.
to create that that action movie trope to happen, and we didn't get that.
Yep.
We got a very natural and human story, right? Because they weren't getting along, and it's because of Echo's trauma that they weren't getting
Yeah.
along, and then like he's stirring up like a lot of damage in powder,
Mhm.
like leading up to the point where it's like, okay, now we're going to be able to work together. And again, this is something that you have to watch because this isn't happening quickly. Like we are
Yeah.
getting montage after montage
Yeah.
to really kind of set in stone that this is taking time.
Yeah.
So they spend a lot of time together before we get to the point of Echo being like, hey, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And then to the point of Echo being like, hey, I think I like you. Like, a lot of time is passing.
Yeah.
And so like if you're not watching it or if like you're just not paying attention when you're watching it, it's very easy to miss that. And but like the fact that they're spending a lot of time together helps makes it feel natural.
Yeah.
For me, the biggest takeaway from this episode is that we now know who the real villain of Arcane is, and the real villain is Vi. Um, because everything kind of works out better if Vi's dead.
Yeah. Okay. Say.
Hey, you laugh at me.
No,
You laugh at me,
listen.
but like there's like
I
there's
get
no
where you're coming
like, sure, there's
from.
no hex deck.
I get where you're coming from, but we gotta save that for the future. So the second thing here, and the final thing before we let set you free, is no obvious and open reference to a zillion. Now, you guys know Zillion's one of our early episodes. You can go back and listen to it if you want to understand where he is and why he's so important to the concept of time, outside of his powers, but to the timeline of Runeterra in general. I thought it would have been there might be an Easter egg. We don't do Easter eggs here. There are plenty of those out there where they dig in and it's like, here's 101 things you miss. There might be something hinting towards him, but for this type of episode, I felt it was probably very important to make a obvious reference to his existence, whether it's him watching on from the background, whether it's his face in the hex tech anomalies that are happening, something to be like, hey, people know who Zillion is. They know he's important. We should probably splash him somewhere here because when we go back to talking about timelines, which if you've watched recent news, they're planning on doing, I feel like that was something you might want to give us a taste of. They didn't, which is fine, but it was one thing that I was like, man, that was the moment.
Yeah, and for me, I feel like that kind of plays into like with the news that is just coming out like this week of them expanding more on specifically Arcane
Yeah.
and more Piltover characters. Is that I feel like the creation or the creative direction right now is just kind of more keep highlighting Piltover while we work on what the next installment of our full TV series is
Yeah.
going to be. Um, and, but I agree that it's definitely a missed opportunity because like Zillion is one of the characters that connects everything together, right? Like
Yeah.
he is bigger than his region.
Yeah.
I mean, much in the same way that Rise is bigger than where he came from.
Yeah.
Or, I guess like in a smaller scale, like Kale and Morgana are bigger than Demacia,
Yeah.
right? Because they are aspects. So they're connected to Mount Targon. Neela is bigger than Bilgewater because she's traveling all over Runeterra. Zillion's one of those characters, and this would have been a very natural place to bring him in.
Yeah.
And like, I'm not saying like give him a lot of face time. I'm
No.
not saying give him lines,
Yep.
or just acknowledge his presence, because not only is it a natural way to acknowledge that there's a bigger world outside of Piltover, it's also a very natural way to start hinting to the viewers who don't know the lore or haven't been keeping up with it for a decade because they're sick.
Yeah.
Um, it's a very natural way to introduce a bigger threat than Victor, because the Victor's great evolution is a big threat.
Yeah.
The Void is a much bigger threat than that.
Yeah.
And if you can start pointing your fingers at like Zillion and what's going on in the time magic space,
Yeah.
you're pointing the finger at the Void, which is arguably the biggest threat to all of Runeterra. And then that way you kind of prop a door open. You don't have to go through it.
Yeah.
Now you don't even have to go through it at all if you want to, but you prop the door open, right? Like, it's like, okay, cool, we have the avenue now. And I wish they would have just kind of given us that.
Agreed. Yeah. Zillion is one of those things, because like you have these different touch points where, like you mentioned, if you're dealing with runes, you need to reference Rise in some aspect. If you're dealing with time, you have to reference Zillion. If you're dealing with the Celestials, you know, you have to reference Asol. You have to do, there's certain things that I think are required based on what's been built. If they change it, that's different, right? If they have a different plan for Zillion, that's different. But as it stands with what we have, yeah, all your points are well put. So we're 50 minutes in, we're done. We won't let this hit an hour. With that, as always, if you stuck around, and even if you didn't, thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with the next Arcane Season 2 episode.
Yeah. Take care, everybody.